trillion from India over a less than 200-year period, starting in 1765. It was unimaginable plunder of a country that was one of the richest economies in the world for 2,000 years. Let's remember, before independence in 1947, 75 years ago, the country included modern-day India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and parts of what was then called Burma. To give some perspective, £45 trillion is 17 times more than Britain's current annual gross national product. Britain specifically set up the looting East India Company to scam and thereby impoverish Indian agricultural peasants and its famed weavers of cotton. Those who have looked at the Indian flag will see that the spinning wheel symbol is at the center of it. It is against this backdrop of British super exploitation through imperialism, white supremacy, colonialism, and rampant capitalism that Indian independence movement leaders emerged. There were many bloody rebellions and massacres of Indians by the British occupiers. Think of Amritsar, the Golden Temple, the massacre of Sikhs. Perhaps most famous among the leaders were Gandhi, Nehru, and Ali Jinnah. Less known are two British Indian-born MPs. There was Dadabhai Naoroji, who was elected Liberal MP for Finsbury Central in London in 1892, 8 years before the founding of the Labour Party, whose working class and anti-colonial politics he shared, though today he would be considered much too left-wing for Starmer's lot. Now, he went on, he was a Congress member, Gandhi was Congress too, and became known as the grand old man of India. Such was his contribution to the independence movement and Congress. Then in 1922 came communist Shapurji Saklatvala, who was elected MP for Battersea North in South London in November that year, a constituency that was 99.9% white, working class, and had a large population of people of Irish descent who worked at places like the Nine Elms railway depot, which we now know as Clapham Junction, one of the hugest railway hubs in the country. He was the Battersea Trades Council and Labour Party MP. I've written a biography of Saklatvala, Comrade Sak, the new edition of which I hope you'll buy. And the organisers of this meeting have said that they will put the link to it in the chat. It mentions, by the way, the rise and fall of Corbynism and why I think the project failed. Saklatvala, a lifelong revolutionary, was a fierce critic of reformist labourism, what he denounced as the labourers. In late 1921, something extraordinary in Labour happened. The party's right-wing ruling National Executive Committee caved in to huge labour movement pressure, particularly the powerful trades councils, and took the almost unprecedented step of endorsing Saklatvala as a Labour parliamentary candidate. Up to 1924, it was possible to belong to the Labour Party and the Communist Party. Let me read you the minutes of the relevant NEC meeting, because they make for fascinating reading. This is from my book, the first appendix. Minutes of the Executive Committee, Labour Party, 7th of December, 1921, National Agents Report. Organisation Subcommittee held on December the 1st, 1921, headed Battersea North. The Secretary and National Agent reported upon an interview they had with representatives of the Battersea Labour Party and Mr. S. Saklatvala, who had been selected as the candidate for the constituency. Considerable discussion ensued as to Mr. Saklatvala's association with the Communist Party, his attack upon the policy of the Independent Labour Party, in continuing its association with the Labour Party and his attempt to form a secessionist ILP group favourable to affiliation with the Third International. It was reported that Mr. Saklatvala, in accepting the candidature for Battersea North, had indicated his acceptance of the Labour Party constitution with its usual implications. Resolved that the candidature of Mr. S. Saklatvala for Battersea North be sanctioned on condition that he accepts the constitution of the party, agrees to receive the Labour whips if returned to Parliament, and abide by the decisions of the Parliamentary Labour Party. Who was Saklatvala? Well, he was born Shapurji Dorabji Saklatvala in Mumbai on March the 28th, to an Indian Parsi family, a small minority of Iran-descended people of the Zoroastrian faith, which is older than Judaism and Christianity. The more famous Freddie Mercury was also a Parsi. Saklatvala is notable for being the first person of Indian heritage, as you heard from Comrade Tina just a moment ago, to become a British Member of Parliament for the Labour Party, and was also among the few members of the Communist Party of Great Britain to serve as an MP. I think there were less than half a dozen, the last being Phil Peratin in the East End of London, who was elected in 1945, defeated it 5 years later in 1950. Saklatvala was the son of a merchant, Dorabji Saklatvala, and his wife, Jerabai, the younger sister of Jamsetji J.N. Tata, the owner of India's largest commercial and industrial empire, worth billions. Today in Britain, they own Jaguar Rover and a large slice of the steel industry. He worked briefly as an iron and coal prospector for Tata, successfully unearthing iron ore and coal deposits in the states of Bihar and Odisha. At an early age, he showed his radicalism. He lobbied Tata to give better pay and conditions to its workers, which didn't find favor with their British clients. Like other Indian merchants at the time, the Tatars became hugely wealthy by collaborating with the British Raj. Saklatvala suffered with malaria, pardon me, which led him to move to England in 1905 to convalesce at a Derbyshire health spa, all paid for by the Tatars. Frankly, they wanted him out of the way. At the spa, he met a young working-class waiter, Sarah Marsh, whom he was later to marry. She was the daughter of a quarryman. He moved to Greater Manchester, to Oldham, to run Tata's office in the city, that's Manchester. He later joined Lincoln's Inn to become a barrister, although he left before qualifying. Saklatvala was always a committed socialist and first joined the Independent Labour Party in Manchester in 1909. Don't forget, they were to the left of the Labour Party and preceded it. The Bolshevik Revolution in Russia of November 1917 was an inspiration to Saklatvala, and following the establishment of the Communist International in 1919, he became active in attempting to affiliate the ILP with that new organization, the Labour Party. Saklatvala joined with Emil Burns, R. Palmdutt, a fellow person of Indian descent. His mother was Swedish, his father was Indian, and said to be the great theorist and ideologue of the Communist Party. In fact, he edited its theoretical journal. There was also J. Walter Newbold, who was elected to Parliament from Scotland, from Motherwell, in 1921 as a fellow communist. Helen Crawford and others as part of an organized faction called the left-wing group of the ILP, which was dedicated to this effort of affiliation. But when the affiliation drive by Saklatvala and the ILP's left wing ended in failure in the party's March 1921 national conference, Saklatvala left the organization with the others in the left wing group to join the new Communist Party of Great Britain. He attended the Second Pan-Africanist Congress held in Paris in 1921 as a delegate of the Communist Party of Great Britain, as a guest of fellow Battersea politician John Archer, a Labour veteran a few years his senior, who became London's first black mayor in 1913. The snap November 1923 general election saw the Communist Party of Great Britain putting forward 9 of its members as candidates, including Saklatvala in Battersea North, where he was unanimously adopted again as the nominee of the Battersea Labour Party. Although not all the communist parties were endorsed by their Labour Party, they were the recipients of support from local Labour activists. And in the main, the Labour Party didn't stand candidates against them. Despite modest gains for Labour in the election overall, the result of the election returned the Conservatives the largest party in the House of Commons, although their number of seats fell from 346 to 259. All communist candidates were defeated in the 1923 election, however, including Saklatvala, very narrowly. The 1924 general election came in the wake of the so-called Zinoviev letter, a Soviet smear planted by the British Secret Service against the Labour Party and the left, and saw the Conservatives increase their vote by more than 2 million to win the election. The Labour Party saw a net loss of 42 seats, despite contesting more constituencies than ever before. In Battersea North, Saklatvala ran without formal Labour endorsement for the first time, but still managed to win election by a slim margin of 544 votes, the only one of 8 Communist Party of Great Britain candidates elected. And during that campaign, he faced vicious racist slurs and attacks from his liberal candidate, Hogbin. Saklatvala was arrested during the 1926 general strike, following a fiery speech he made in support of striking miners, and was jailed for 2 months on a charge of sedition. That was at a Hyde Park rally, where he said he was prepared to be shot down by troops if necessary in defense of striking workers, among whom he was popular in England, Scotland, and Ireland, which he toured, the latter of which he visited several times to support left-wing politicians, including James Larkin, as I detailed in my book. I've come up with some fascinating and really important Labour movement Irish historical detail. Saklatvala was active in the League Against Imperialism from the time of its formation in 1927. It became the movement for colonial freedom. Some of you will recall that Fenner Brockway was a leading light in that. It's now called Liberation. He had a bitter dispute with Gandhi over tactics in 1927. Gandhi famously promoting non-violent civil disobedience against the British to gain Indian independence. And Saklatvala took the more hardline communist position of a revolutionary uprising by workers and peasants being needed. And I document that fascinating correspondence in my book, and scholars, including the Cambridge eminent professor, Priyamvada Gopal, in her amazing Insurgent Empire book, quote my correspondence, and I'm pleased to say praise the scholarship of my book. Saklatvala's parliamentary career was punctuated by wonderful socialist, anti-imperialist, anti-colonialist, and pro-independence speeches. Even his Tory enemies flocked to the House of Commons chamber to listen to. And he didn't confine himself to just talking about India. He talked about the need for independence in Palestine, in Iraq, all over the world, in Africa, in Asia. They marveled, his critics, at his blistering use of facts as part of his unanswerable arguments. Remarkably, he used no notes. His parliamentary career was effectively ended when he lost his seat in the 1929 general election with an official Labour candidate standing against him for the first time. So at this point, he ran solely on the communist ticket. He ran again in 1930 in a by-election in Glasgow Shettleston in Scotland without success, and mounted a final losing campaign in the 1931 general election in Battersea. In 1934, he visited the Soviet Union to tour the country's Far East republics, whose governance he compared favorably to that in British India. During that tour, he suffered a heart attack, but recovered. And I have to say that at the end of the 20s, he went on a monumental tour of India, being greeted by crowds of adoring fans everywhere he went, to the point at which the British, and this included, to our Labour Party's shame, British administration, the Labour administration, barred him from ever returning to his native land. Even when his mother died, he wasn't allowed to return to be at her funeral. And I had this discussion with Tony Benn because his father was the Indian colonial secretary who was a part of that ban. And I said, should I mention the fact that your father was a part of that ban? And Tony said, yes, you must, because it's a historical fact. He was caught up in a ghastly colonial mindset, and I'm very sorry that he did what he did. During the 1935 general election, Saklatvala was active in the electoral campaigns of Harry Pollitt and Willie Gallagher. Willie Gallagher became a communist member of parliament in Scotland, but Harry Pollitt just missed out in the Rhondda in Wales by a handful of votes. Saklatvala, aged just 61, died from a second heart attack on the 16th of January 1936 at his Highgate, London home. But his legacy lives on in our continuing struggles for socialism, internationalism, and social justice. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, comrade. Excellent. I do have a few questions, perhaps before we open up for questions and comments from the floor. So you start off by explaining that he was a member of the Tata family, and they were obviously quite rich then. Do you know the relationship? Did they support him? Did they turn their backs on him? Or how was the relationship with the family?
Well, it's a fascinating one, that, Comrade Tina, because J.N. Tata, who was the owner of the company, had a bit of a soft spot for his nephew. I think he was, a sort of closet radical. Like he supported the notion of Indian independence. He called one of his factories Swaj, which means self-help. And but he couldn't overtly come out and support his nephew's sort of radical views, because it would have been bad for business with his British clients. But the reason I mention that is that Saklatvala wasn't cut off by the Tatars. Even though he was this radical communist, they maintained him with a wage from Tatar, the equivalent of a departmental manager, so that he could survive. Because back in the day, MPs weren't paid. They certainly weren't paid the 100,000 that they get today. They got a pittance. So a lot of working class people, a lot of people without independent means couldn't be MPs. But Saklatvala was insulated, if you'd like, by this largesse from the Tatars, which they continued to pay him.
That's interesting. It's a bit like Frederick Engels, who obviously was, on the other side, but not politically with the working class, and financially, sociologically with the ruling class. but that doesn't mean you can't fight with the working class. The relationship between the Labour Party and the CPGB at that time is very interesting, isn't it? The Labour Party had just been formed and was quite different to what it was today. So you read out that letter where they questioned him quite a lot, but not all communist MPs were accepted into the Labour fold. Is that correct? I mean, Newbold, I think, who was elected with him, wasn't allowed to join the Labour Party fraction. What was the difference between those two? Do you know?
Well, Newbold was in Scotland. I don't think the trade union movement mattered as much. I'm not in any way trying to diminish the importance of the Scottish Labour movement, because, if you think of the Dockers in Glasgow and Red Clydeside, they became tremendously important. But there was a real fear in the Labour Party of what might happen if they turned down the Battersea Trades Council, the London Trades Council movement's candidate. So the dynamic was different. It was the same for Willie Gallagher, but of course he came along a bit later. Huge fights in the Labour Party. As I said, to start with, the Communist Party was affiliated to the Labour Party. Up until 1924, you could be a joint member of the Labour Party and the Labour Party and the Communist Party. Big, fights. I mean, Lenin had said to the British communists that they should join the Labour Party. They should support Labour candidates. But, there's that old quote, isn't there, that we should support the Labour Party like a hangman's noose supports a condemned man. Yeah. To break that down in the, sort of demotic, what Comrade Lenin was saying was that to outwardly oppose the Labour Party among a working class that voted for it without raising the consciousness of the class and getting to understand the contradictions and the sellouts wouldn't work. And you'll remember there was that disastrous class against class line that the Communist Party took, where they described the Labour Party as the third capitalist force that had to be smashed along with the liberals. And this was not popular among the working class. The Communist Party suffered its worst electoral fortunes under that, what was called the New Line, which Saklatvala, by the way, was the main advocate of. He was a left-wing communist, if there's such a definition. He was hardline. And in a way, he signed his own demise by taking that particular line.
I was going to ask you about that as next, because him going to the Soviet Union in 1934, that was quite a different place than, after the Russian Revolution. A lot of communists got inspired by the Russian Revolution, but obviously with Stalin in charge, etc., things changed quite quickly. So was he a Stalinist? Was he a follower of Stalin in your assessment?
Well, Stalinism hadn't been developed. And you'll recall that there was a communist who was originally a part of the Liberal Party, who was actually the first communist MP, I think about 1919, wasn't it? Gosh, I've got to refresh my memory on his name. Do you remember his name?
I can't.
He had like a French name. I'll tell you before the end of the broadcast. But he'd gone to the Soviet Union and on a delegation, a parliamentary delegation, and had been so taken aback by the progress, the economic, like people going to Cuba today and saying, oh, the education system is fantastic, health service is fantastic, the social, provision side is great, and being converted by their experience, and came back and declared himself as a communist MP.
I think it's Cecile Lestrange Malone. I don't even know how to pronounce it.
That's the one. Yeah. That's the one. How did you find that? You Googled it, did you?
I've Googled it quickly, yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Yes, he was the first. He was the first communist MP. What year was that?
Sorry?
What year was that?
Yeah, I think 1920.
He went
Switched in 1920 from the Liberals to the Communist Party. Yeah.
That's right. He went in 1919 and came back by 1920. Malone was a communist.
Yeah. Well, so some people are making adjustments, aren't they? So, what's the sort of most surprising thing you learned about Comrade Sak in your research?
I think that, like Tony Benn, he became more left-wing.
Mm.
Because let's remember, when he first came to Britain, he was hobnobbing with the Liberals. He went to stay at the National Liberal Club in Whitehall. He had a room there, it was a gentleman's club, and he was hobnobbing with the Liberals. Then he was mixing with the Independent Labour Party. Then he was a part of the left faction of the Independent Labour Party. Then he's one of the driving forces saying we should disaffiliate from the Labour Party. Then he becomes a left-wing communist. I mean, I find that fascinating for someone who was so high-born and born with a silver spoon in his mouth and could have been just a billionaire like all his relatives, but decided to take the cause of the working class, the anti-imperialists, the anti-colonialists, and the communists as his ruling mantra.
So you said he was arrested in the 1926 general strike, which was a hugely interesting period also because the TUC, of course, didn't actually want to do it and collapsed pretty quickly. How was his relationship with these forces, and did he play a leading role in that whole movement?
Well, he couldn't play much of a role after he was locked up. I mean, he was put in front of the magistrate at Bow Street, who gave him an opportunity to repent for his so-called sin and retract his support for the strike and repudiate it. And he said he absolutely would not. He would rather go down to the cells. and I quote in the book, that was the only time we have evidence of his wife Sarah ever, because she was a liberal. I think her family were liberals. And, he turned to her and she went, hurrah! So she supported his defiance. Cool. But no, he was no big fan of the trade union bureaucrats, what Lenin called the aristocrats of labor, and what they eventually did to sell out the strike. He was for the trades councils. Don't forget, they organized fantastic hubs of resistance in communities, the likes of which we can learn from today. What we sometimes call rank and fileism, the shop stewards movements. They didn't rely on Congress House to organize things. The general strike was organized in communities, but it was destroyed and sabotaged from the top, as we know from history.
We did discuss the general strike in one of these sessions, and it is, of course, it is a hugely political act. If you're serious about a real general strike, then you're asking the question of power, isn't it? Who runs the country? And it is questionable if the Communist Party or the Labour Party would have been able or prepared to actually go that far. In terms of India and where he came from, how involved was he in the sort of anti-colonial struggles?
Well, he was very involved. The British security services said that the reason why he was going to India was not just on a speaking tour, but to carry vital information and documents to communist agitators and dissidents in India. So he wasn't pronouncing from thousands of miles away in Westminster. He was actively involved in fomenting revolution in India. M.N. Roy, I don't know how familiar you are with some of the communists from that period. There was M.N. Roy, there's Rajani Palmdutt. He was integral in actually shaping Communist Party policy, because I'm critical in my book of some of it which was quite patronizing. In other words, seeing India as a subsection of the British Communist Party, not a communist party, fully fledged in its own right. And I think that that's not right. I don't think that he felt that they properly prioritized the independence struggle, the anti-colonial struggle, as much as he would like. And he was instrumental in saying, look, this is very important. It's not just about industrial revolution in Europe, what we might call Eurocentric communism. This is about world revolution. And you can't have world revolution while the struggling masses in the South are oppressed and not being properly resourced in their resistance to imperialism, colonialism, and capitalism. So I think he played a major role in shaping Communist Party international policy, and that is not properly acknowledged or recognized.
Indeed. Brings me to my last question before I bring in Comrade Carroll. Racism inside the left. I mean, there's is an interesting subject, which is still, interesting to this day and not quite resolved, I think. But for example, the union movement, when it comes to black bus drivers, do you remember that, when they mobilized against black people being allowed to work on the buses? Similar with women, of course, so you have that tension between, we have to defend our own position against the outsiders, those who want to take our jobs away. Was there something similar going on within the communist movement, in the early communist movement? Because it seems quite advanced to have an Indian MP, considering where we're now.
Well, I cover these issues in the book. And Lenin was very clear. When he was confronted by Ukrainian communists and South African communists who complained, but the blacks want to throw us into the sea, that they were fearful that the black masses, the working class, would want to in some way harm white members of the movement. Lenin said that, he supported a black republic. This was put forward by a Finnish communist. I should know this because my mother's Finnish, and I'll give you his name in a moment. He was tasked with Otto Kuusinen was tasked with coming up with a bureau that put forward the position. And Comrade Lenin said to the Ukrainians and the South Africans, well, if you have a backward position on our policy of a black republic, then maybe you should be pushed into the sea. He was very clear in his support of the black working class. He was in advance of some of the backward elements. And I'll return to your country, Germany, where in the First World War, there was something called the Horror on the Rhine. Have you heard of that? No. It was about Francophone, mainly Senegalese troops that were based in the Ruhr. And the left said, ran smear stories saying we're fearful for our women, we're fearful of these black troops, all the usual crap that you get. We had this in Britain as well. And the left was actually supporting, through the Fabians, people like Lassalle, this backward racist language and rhetoric, to our shame, as the left. So there are dirty parts of our history. And my cousin, who was the leader of the Finnish Communist Party, Jukka Kainoja, very kindly gave me a testimonial from my book saying, what Wadsworth has uncovered is some dirty passages in our communist history that need to be uncovered. It's important for us to have a proper rendition of our history so that we can be better communists in the future.
Absolutely. I've put the link to your book a few times in the chat. I will do it again. Were there sort of, and I apologize for my ignorance in this respect, but were there sort of black sections around at the time, and there were I know there were women's sections in the communist movement. Were there
Yeah.
black sections as well? Did black people organize separately within the communist movement?
No, they didn't. But you had people like George Padmore, who were very prominent, well worth a Google. A great communist, but later denounced as a petty bourgeois black nationalist, sadly, which I think is a wrong characterization of him. I would say that Saklatvala's work with Richard Archer, who is an African Caribbean, was a first black section in the 1920s. Right. Here they were, African Caribbean, Asian, working together, going to the Pan-Africanist Congress, talking about people of color of the world uniting together as workers to fight oppression. To me, that was nascent black section politics. And so, it took a while until the sort of 40s, 50s, and 60s for black people in the Communist Party, people like Trevor Carter, people like Asquith Gibbs, Harry Haywood in America, Angela Davis after that, to become prominent. It has happened, and I think it will continue. By the way, follow me on Twitter, Marc Wads at, what's it called? At Marc Wads, M-A-R-C Wads. I'm trying to build up my followers.
Okay, I'll put that in the chat in a second as well.
Thank you. Thanks.
I've just been told the Queen is dead.
Oh,
long
dear.
live King Charles, or whatever he's going to be known as.
Long live republicanism.
Indeed, and let's hope he'll bring us a big step closer to a republic.
Yes.
Fingers crossed. Okay, Comrade Carol, please.
All right, thank you very much indeed, Marc. Fascinating talk about someone I knew nothing about until 55 minutes ago. Tina asked one of the questions I was going to ask about how much effect he had in India as well. Yeah. But I'm also wondering how much effect he had in his family, that ran the Tata company. Did they treat their workers well? Did they give good working conditions and good wages? Because you said that was it his father or who supported him, or the company supported him? Did they support him in any way in the way they treated their employees?
I'm afraid not. Oh. I'd like to say in the affirmative. What I can say about the Tatars is because of their religion, which is Zoroastrianism, they believed in philanthropy. So they're not supposed to make a profit. So they're supposed to put all the profit into supporting their workforce. And they actually built a city in India based on their profits, where everybody was well housed and educated and had health care. He was a part of that tradition. But I can't say that you could hold them up and say, oh, they're an exemplar in the British Raj as a result of this errant, you could say, rogue relative. He criticized the Tatars in Parliament, as capitalists, as exploiters. I'm surprised they put up with him, but because I think his uncle had a soft spot for him, they kind of gritted their teeth and looked the other way and pretended that he hadn't spoken in the way that he did.
Okay, so it's a bit like the Quakers and the Cadburys, isn't it? At least providing.
To your question.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Carol.
Yeah.
Okay, Ken.
Hello. Thank you very much for your talk, Marc. I'm interested to know how far his political activity changed once he made his final attempt to get elected to Parliament. Did he maintain links with the Labour Party and try to change their views at all? Did he try and influence them to take other communist people into the party as candidates for Parliament? Or did his activity shift in different directions? You've already said he did a lot of work with India, but I'm just curious to know how far his political activities in this country altered after, I think it was 31 when he lost his last by-election. Thank you.
No, his political position in regard to the Labour Party hardened as a result of the New Line, which he was a big proponent of. So he wanted nothing to do with them. I mean, originally there were Scottish leftists that would second motions from him and give him some sort of parliamentary support. Not much south of the border, I have to say. But no, he became bitterly opposed to Laborism, the Labourals, as he called them. He saw them as no better than the Tories or the Liberals. And so he ended up being very opposed. And there were slogans all the way around the Shettleston constituency in Glasgow attacking the Labour Party, of which he was a party to.
Just on that, actually, because Ken mentioned India again, how was his relationship, if you had any, with Gandhi? You mentioned him at the beginning, but Gandhi obviously had quite a different way of doing politics compared to, a communist. Did they meet? Did they get on?
They didn't meet, but he mocked Gandhi as a mysticist, someone into a sort of spiritualism and belief in a higher order that wasn't of this earth. Gandhi was called the Mahatma, as you know, which is an honorific title. And he mocked that as well, trying to say, oh, you're trying to say you're someone special, but you're not. So he tried to be respectful towards someone who was an elder, someone who was older than him. But it did get a bit, how can I put it? Not toxic, but
colorful, the language.
Florid language. Read the book and you'll see the correspondence. I think towards the end, he was not abusive, because Saklatvala was genteel, but harsher in his criticism of this guy that he felt was leading the Indian working class in the wrong direction.
I think it's quite important that lefts or communists as us, like us, should take a critical look at people like Gandhi, Mother Teresa, or something. That the establishment thinks did a marvelous job when in fact they really, really didn't.
Well, don't forget that Gandhi is being reassessed in Africa, because he spent the time in South Africa where he worked as a lawyer, and he was quite racist towards Africans in some of the things that he said.
Right.
And we find that, monuments are being taken down in Africa. I've been to South Africa. I keep in touch with revolutionary communists over there. And there's a real reassessment, which I touch upon in the new edition of my book, of Gandhi's role towards Africans.
Quite right. Okay. Anthony.
Which wasn't very progressive.
I want to talk about the two different epochs between the rise of imperialism, its decay, and also the crisis in this country.
Can you talk a bit slower, comrade, please?
Yeah. Am I slower now?
Yes.
I'll start now. Before I go into the nature of the epoch with the rise of imperialism and its decay today and the crisis today, I want to talk a bit about Sachs' life. Because what you have was showing the middle class, he was ruling class, but showing the middle classes are broken from liberalism, they're going to communism and Trotskyism. They're trying to pull them back into the system. They're really worried about this radicalization because they could threaten the whole capitalist system. So they get them academic posts and all the maneuvering that goes on to pull them back. It was to his credit, he started with the working class and the revolution, despite the mistakes he made, because of his instability of his class roots. And also, some people are more able than others. He has more than a whole variety of lives. But when he became a Stalinist, he went from alt to left, and did he go with the Popular Front? And also in France, when they made the agreement with France with the Soviet bureaucracy, that they supported the French colonialism in the mid-30s. Obviously, with the Second World War, we defended the Soviet Union against German imperialism, trying to restore capitalism, but we didn't agree with the diplomatic alliance with British and Anglo-British imperialism because they supported the famine in India and the crushing of all the Indian revolts. But today, there's a severe capitalist crisis with the Queen dying now. There's a severe crisis of capitalist rule. There's obviously a battle between different wings of the ruling class. You mentioned the Brixton upheaval. You mentioned the strikes, the protests. And in Europe today, and I'll finish on the possibilities and the dangers. In Europe, there's mass protests throughout the whole of Europe against the sanctions on Russia, against the war drive against Russia. In Prague, there's 100,000 people marching. There's going to be a general strike on the 25th of September, mass protests in Germany, which were anti-Stalinist in 1989, supported German unification, destroy the workers, so that's another dynamic. But those Mondays, and now you might know some in Tina, are coming out against what they're doing to Russia. And in France, there's strikes going on, but there's some very big dangers. I don't know, NATO may come out with Article 5 on Iran because they're trying to make a cyber attack on Albania, and they're talking about hitting them. And they're talking now, all the papers, the Mail, the Express, about limiting nuclear war with Russia if they use tactical nuclear weapons. So there's big dangers. But I'll finish it. We have to have a united front with the stance against capitalist restoration in Russia and China. But I'm also reading The Revolution with Trade. And it's where you see the gains in there, the glorified fascism under Mussolini, but they'll talk about the contradictions of Stalin as well. But that's a very good book. You learn more from that than a lot of the left today that we've got to apply to the concrete reality. I'll leave it there. I'm going to go now. I'll see you next week.
Thank you.
I'll see you. It's Monday going ahead, Tina.
Yes.
Yeah, I'll see you Monday.
TV Monday meeting. Yes. Thank you.
I'm going to go up watch the news now.
Thanks. That Anthony's point in terms of imperialism is interesting. It's something I wanted to ask you. Maybe we can use this to wrap up.
Yeah, I did say I have to leave shortly.
Yes. Yeah. I know. We're
and that was
10 to 7. We're going to finish by 7.
Yeah.
Which is the question of his attitude towards war. I noticed one of his sons, I've just seen on Wikipedia, joined the British Army in World War II. Like, you know, if I was...
He was in the Air Force, the auxiliary. Yeah.
But, you know, for a communist, that can be quite a tough thing, you know, if your child joins the army, etc. But what was his attitude to World War I, which kind of split the Communist and Socialist International, with a lot of socialists ended up supporting their own... imperialist ruling class. What was his position on all of that?
Well, he was against. I mean, it's a big red line, isn't it? It split the SPD, as you'll know, in Germany, with Rosa Luxemburg, with the parliamentary party supporting war and the rank and file not. Worse, actually, than Keiko, his second son, joining the Air Auxiliary, was that his doctor, first son, de Rabji, was a conservative, joined the Conservative Party. I mean, imagine that. You know, he didn't want him in the house.
Oh, God.
And don't forget that his wife and her family were basically liberals. I think if he'd have been more prescriptive, he wouldn't have spoken to half of his family, including the Tatars. So he plowed a furrow. I mean, he had a cousin who ended up as a diplomat for Iran, then Persia, in America, who described Saklatvala as an evil genius, and said he was someone that should be opposed at every turn because he was a very dangerous figure in society. He just got on with it, comrade. He did what he had to do, said what he had to say, took the actions that he thought were the correct actions, and to hell with people who didn't agree. And I think that we should have more of that conviction politics on the left today,
Absolutely.
don't you? We weren't seeing a lot of it from Corbyn. I'm sorry, I don't mean to criticize him. I criticize the politically dead, but there were big mistakes made.
Absolutely.
Not taking on the right wing, not fighting the witch hunt, appalling over Brexit, appalling over the IHRA. You know, do I need to list? Still supporting NATO, don't forget.
Yes.
You know,
yes, there was an attempt to bring the right on board when clearly the right was saying all the way through, we're not coming on board with you.
Economic policies that were like Scandinavian social democracy, they weren't particularly left-wing.
No. What's for you then the key thing, the key lesson that comrades today can learn from Comrade Sak looking back? I mean, apart, let's say from fighting for your politics openly and, not shying away from a fight. What's the sort of other key lessons you've learned from Comrade Sak?
Be true to yourself. Corbyn should have been true to himself. McDonnell should have been true to themselves. One senses that McDonnell may be a Marxist at heart. I think that Jeremy Corbyn is a left liberal. I think in any party I'd like to belong to that's left-wing, he'd be the sort of lefty centre. And I think that they wouldn't have won, but we could have carved out a space for the left that the right wing couldn't turn back. We could have taken over, as Jeremy promised me at the very beginning, the Labour Party machine. And we didn't do that. It took 3 years to get rid of right-wing saboteur McNichol. We didn't clear out all of those people who denied us the 2019, was it 2019, 2017 election?
Yeah.
That's self-inflicted harm. And we've got to be more ruthless in the future. We've got to be more convicted. And we've got to be more socialist and more anti-racist. What did that mob do for black self-organization? They had 5 years to fix the fact that the BAME Labour is moribund. It's been dead for 10 years. It only served to put Keith Vaz on the NEC for, I think, 17 years or whatever it was. That could have been a bulwark for leftism. Bringing back black section left politics that I was proud to lead in the 80s. No, we were just shunted into a sort of siding by the Corbyn left. And so we weren't there to fight and defend and be a part of the Praetorian Guard. I was chucked out. Jackie Walker was chucked out. Chris Williamson, Ken Livingstone was driven out, all on his watch. Can't blame anybody else for that. Carrie Murphy, Jenny Formby, we have to call them out. Yep. What did they do to fight? And Saklatvala would have fought. And that's what we must do.
Absolutely, I totally agree. As you know, we've worked together in Labour Against the Witch Hunt. Next week, comrades, we'll be looking at John McLean, Scottish revolutionary, who will be introduced by Sandy McBurney. And the series continues further. If you would like to introduce somebody from our history who has inspired you, please get in touch. Write an email to info@labourleft.org and we can bring you on to discuss that. Thank you very much, Marc, for joining us tonight. I let you go now. I know you had a long day and we've got another meeting ahead. I was just going to tell comrades about the Future of the Left event in Liverpool, which is taking place, and Marc will be speaking at that as well, taking place in Liverpool during the Labour Party conference, organised by socialists in and around Liverpool and beyond. The Labour Left Alliance is also sponsoring that. Go to the website, please, if you can. Maybe Ken, you could put the link into the chat. That would be fantastic. So comrades can get their tickets, and that's a really important event on Redline TV next Monday. As Anthony mentioned, we're discussing the issue of class war, and we'll be looking at the Labour Party and our lovely new Prime Minister Liz Truss and see what they have in store for us. And we've got a few interesting guests on that issue. So thank you very much, comrades, for joining us. Thank you very much, Marc. I think maybe Ken can't find the website, so I'm just going to look for it quickly. So it's futureoftheleft.org.uk. You can get tickets there. It will be streamed to very high quality, but there's also space for real life visitors. So if you can come to Liverpool, there are limited seats for Monday and Tuesday. Wednesday, we're going to be in a bigger hall discussing, is the Labour Party dead? There's a number of options, and they're not a yes or no question, I think. And what's the future of the left? And we'll have a varied panel there with all sorts of people joining us to discuss that. Thank you very much, comrades. Have a good evening, and hopefully see you next week on Thursday and on Monday at Red Lions TV. Good night.